All right, I'm going to take my customary drink here. It's not easy to talk for an hour, you guys. All right, so politics. All right, this one's going to be a doozy. All right, today we will be reviewing book 3 of last week's podcast before moving on to examine book 4. All right, so in last week's podcast, we examined how essential Socrates considers a proper training in both the musical and gymnastic arts are for the guardian class. We also read about his rather shocking ethic that people with sickness that can't be remedied should be allowed to die off, and furthermore, that capital punishment should be used as a penalty for lawbreaking. Now, without commenting on whether capital punishment, I'm in favor of capital punishment or not. We'll save that for later. So thus, these two directives for the medicinal and juristic practices are essentially two different means of population control, and he says this like kind of explicitly. Beginning quote, "Then you will establish by law in the city a medical art of the sort we were talking about, together with this sort of judicial art, sorry. They'll care for the bodies and souls of your citizens, those with good natures that is, but for those who lack them, they'll allow all those so lacking in body to die off, and they themselves will put to death those who are of an evil nature and soul and not curable." All right, and then finally, we considered his idea of the noble lie as a means of keeping people obedient. Um, Beginning quote, "Then could we come up with some contrivance from among the lies that come along in case of need, the ones we were talking about just now, some one noble lie to persuade at best even the rulers themselves, but if not, the rest of the city." So this noble lie includes things like that each person was made with either a mixture of gold, silver, or bronze and iron, and that whichever mixture they were born with, it corresponds to their job. So gold is associated with the guardians. Oh, excuse me. Silver with the auxiliaries, and bronze and iron with the money-making part. So this noble lie also includes strict instructions for the maintenance of each class, arguing that children born of different metals than their parents should be taken away from them, and finally that if a bronze or iron were to come to rule, bronze or iron nature were to come to rule, the city would collapse. All right, well, that ends the intro, so let's now turn to book 4. I worked really hard on this, so this one is there's a lot of content in this one, so we'll try to take our time going through it. All right. The beginning of book 4 starts with Adeimantus interrupting his brother Glaucon to argue that the guardian class described is not one that will make guardians happy, since it involves the sacrifice of many things which ordinary people would call desirable, such as wealth, comfortable housing, and other things like that. Socrates counters by arguing that what is being built is not happiness, but for the individual, but happiness for the city as a whole. And it is for the protection of the city that the guardians, sacrifice all of these things. He then argues that, both the extreme of riches and the extreme of poverty should be avoided among the guardian class, since riches make one lazy and poverty makes one stingy. As a result, it is necessary to look at the city as a whole for its justice and happiness rather than on any individual part, or at least to look on the city as a whole for justice before looking at justice and happiness in the individual. As for how to preserve this happiness, Socrates argues that stability of music and gymnastics is necessary, and that all the little things which aren't strictly laws, such as children standing before their elders, would eventually be found out by them. So, kind of like social customs, like bowing and curtsying and stuff like that. Having given it sufficiently enough thought to the city's origin and upkeep, Socrates is now ready to locate and define justice. Here we go. This is it. He argues that there are 4 virtues which the city possesses: wisdom, courage, moderateness, and justice, and that the best way of finding out what justice is to define and locate the other 3 virtues in the city, so that whatever part is left over would belong to the virtue of justice. So this is essentially like an ad reductio ad absurdum argument, where you're going to say, kind of in reverse, actually kind of the opposite of an ad reductio ad absurdum argument, because you're going to figure out what the three virtues before justice are for, and then whatever is left is going to be justice. So kind of like uh, a bit of a game of hide and seek or whatever. Justice will be the last one standing. Okay, so yeah, and if you're wondering where these four virtues come from, sorry, I should know this: wisdom, courage, moderateness, and justice. Well, Plato doesn't really give us any reason to take those as the four virtues that a city must have at face value. Um, Certainly, justice would make sense, but it's a little weird that there isn't. That he just takes this on intuition and doesn't go into why these four virtues specifically out of all the possible virtues out there. Okay, so to establish this argument, remember we've just introduced the four virtues of wisdom, courage, moderateness, and justice. And Socrates is going to go down the line and examine each one before returning to justice. So in the first place, Socrates examines wisdom and determines that it is that by which the city is well counseled by its ruling part. Next, Socrates defines courage as knowing what to fear and what not to fear, and as a preservation or power in the face of all manner of ills. Finally, he defines moderateness as a mutual concord between classes over who should rule. After considering these three virtues, Socrates argues that the thing left over is the doing of what is properly one's own, which must correspond to justice. So this is the answer. This is the answer to the entire book's question. The thing left over from this examination is the doing of what is properly one's own. Justice is the doing of what is properly one's own. So in the city, this means that each class does what is properly its own: the gold to rule with wisdom, the silver to act courageously, and the bronze/iron to act moderately without meddling from other classes. Justice, therefore, applies to every class rather than to any one class, as the other three virtues do. All right, so having found out what justice is in the state, Socrates now turns to examine justice in the individual, which, as we saw in Book 2, was considered by Socrates to be in line with justice in the state. If you'll remember Socrates' example of a large rock with letters and a small rock with letters, and you can't see the small rock, but you can see the big rock, then his argument was, well, you should look at the letters on the big rock, and those will help you understand the letters on the small rock that you can't read. So so now we have the city laid out. We have justice in the city laid out. We already examined how the origins of a city lead to the city and how the city is just. So the last thing to do is to examine how the individual is just. And Socrates argues that again, these three virtues apply to the individual, and as these three virtues four virtues, wisdom, courage, moderateness, and justice that rule over the soul, just as they rule over in the city. So this, for Plato, they're essentially a mirror of each other. Like the city is bigger, obviously, but the same principles apply to both in both cases. So this is Plato's famous theory of the tripartite soul, and that just means the soul split into three parts. So to begin with this argument, Socrates argues that it is impossible for opposite inclinations to exist at the same time. Taking the example of thirst, he argues that everyone at some point or another has restrained himself from quenching it, like I am right now, actually. Furthermore, thirst is always a desire for drink and never manifests as anything else. Therefore, since opposite inclinations can't exist at the same time in one part of the soul, and since thirst never manifests as anything else in the part of the soul it's in, there must be another part of the soul corresponding to the part of the soul that prevented the quenching of thirst. So basically what he's saying is so basically what he's saying is thirst always exists as a desire for the same thing. Like if you get the feeling of thirst, you're not gonna want to eat, food. to satisfy the thirst, you're going to want to drink something. Um, and so that desire pops up, or another desire like hunger, and we recognize what that means and what we have to do to remedy it, because they only come up for, the one thing that they're trying to get your body to do. In thirst case, like water, and hunger's case, food. So on the basis, so if you're holding back on satisfying your thirst, as I am right now, or hunger, then it can't be the same part of the soul that is having the thirst and the hunger, holding itself, being at war with itself. There must be another part which um, says, yay or nay to that desire, or then that other part, and that part is capable of pulling the desiring part of the soul away from thirst or hunger. So, on the basis of this argument, Socrates goes on to put all animal desires, which manifest only as themselves, into what he terms the animal part of the soul, and the desire which regulates these animal impulses as the reasoning part. So, does this mean there are only two parts of the soul? No. Socrates locates a third part of the soul, the spirited part, which he argues is present in all animals and small children, and which includes emotional desires but is irrational in and of itself. So, therefore, Socrates argues that on the basis of this, that there must be three parts of the soul as there were in the city, since the individual must correspond to the city. So he's using two arguments here. He's using one from observation of animals and children, and one from the sameness of the individual to the city. So two arguments going there. Finally, Socrates considers justice in the individual, which he argues is the doing of each part what is properly its own without meddling from any other part. A virtue which, once again, he argues, encompasses all three parts of the soul. So remember, the in the city and in the soul, like the rational part is associated with wisdom, the spirited part is associated with courage, the animal part is associated with moderateness, but justice is associated with all of them, because it governs how it governs how they behave in relation to each other. Um, so yeah, and actually, incidentally, this is why Socrates spoke so much about musical and gymnastic training in the last book, um, because these two disciplines train the rational and spirited part of the soul how to govern over the appetitive or animal part of the soul. So there was some relevance there for what he was talking about. So how does the soul move then? This is the next question. Does each part move individually from the other, or do all act when something is done? Well, since justice permeates all the other virtues, as you just said, it governs all of them and binds them together into one action, it would seem logical that it is the entire soul acting at once in every action. Otherwise, if each part moved individually independent of the others, the entire person would be unable to act with more than one part of the soul at a time. Beginning quote. And the truth is, justice was something like that as it seems, but not anything connected with doing what it properly belongs to oneself externally, but with what's on the inside that truly concerns oneself and properly belongs to oneself, not allowing each thing in him to do what's alien to it, or the classes of things in his soul to meddle with one another, but setting his own house in order in his very being. He himself ruling over and bringing order to himself, and becoming his own friend and harmonizing three things, exactly like the three notes marking a musical scale: the low end, the high end, and the middle. Oh man, that's a genius example. Uh, and if any other things happen to be between them, he binds all of them together and becomes entirely one out of many, moderate and harmonized. Only when he's in this condition does he act. If he performs any action having to do with acquiring money or taking care of the body, as well as anything of a civic kind or having to do with private transactions, in all these cases he regards an action that preserves that condition and helps to complete it as a just and beautiful act, and gives it that name, and regards as wisdom the knowledge that directs that action. Anything that always breaks down that condition he regards as an unjust action, and the opinion that directs that he regards as ignorance. End quote. It's a long quote, but this is the meat of the book right here. Um, yeah, wow, yeah, and also it's just a spectacular. The harmonization of music is just a spectacular analogy for what he's trying to get across. Um, all right, so in conclusion, then, Socrates begins Book 4 by arguing that it is the happiness of the city that is being aimed at, rather than that of any particular individual. He argues that musical and gymnastic training are essential for the upbringing of people, and later in the book argues that it is through this training that men are better able to rule themselves. This concludes Socrates' inspection into the origins of the city, and he now turns to tackle the concept of justice in the city and the individual, the topic upon which the whole entire book is centered on. Socrates argues that there are four virtues in the city: wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice, and that justice is whatever is left over after having considered the other three. Wisdom refers to good counsel, courage to knowledge of what ought or ought not to be feared, and moderation to an accord between classes as to who should rule. Um, Socrates argues that justice, then, must be the doing of what is properly one's own in each of the classes without interference from another class. Extending this to the individual, Socrates argues that there are three parts to the soul: a reasoning part, a spirited part, and a desiring part, or an animal part. Each of these three parts corresponds to the three parts of the city, and justice in the individual, as in the state, is the doing of each part of the soul what is properly its own without interference from another. Justice in the individual permeates all three parts of the soul and is that which binds them into a single action rather than each part having to act on their own. All right, so that was a bit of a doozy there. Next week we'll be taking a look at book 5, and yeah, I'm really sorry. I know I mentioned in the last podcast that I wanted to do two books of Plato's Republic at a time, but it was seeing book 4 and how detailed it was. There isn't enough time for me to put in. There wasn't enough time for me to put book 5 in. So we'll look at book 5. Maybe we'll just do book 5 next time, or maybe we will do book 5 and book 6, part of book 6, or something like that. But we'll figure it out as we go along.